When did we start to forget what is beneath our feet, as if the earth was at just surface, not memory? If you feel that certain questions return like echoes, perhaps this is the right time to listen. Europe, with its cathedrals, empires, and ruins, seems to tell everything in the sunlight. But there are stories who chose silence. Stories that came down, not out of fear, but out of necessity. Beneath living cities, forgotten cities sleep, hoping not to excavations, but awareness. Because remembering hurts and remembering transforms, and not all the age is ready for what the past reveals. Today, there is something deeply human about the act of descending. From the prehistoric caves, even the underground shelters, the underground has always been a refuge, a womb, silence. When the surface becomes hostile, the soul seeks depth. And maybe that's why, under Europe, we find not just tunnels, but entire cities, planned, inhabited, then sealed. Places where people loved, prayed, waited. Places that disappeared from maps but not from the invisible field of history. I'll explore them. We don't just touch stones, we touch choices, fears, and ancient wisdom, still pulsing in the dark, waiting to be heard. Because what was rarely buried, it's dead, just asleep. Here, the curious thing is that these cities were not buried by chance. Many were deliberately closed, entrances hidden, corridors sealed. How if someone had decided to protect something or wait for a better time? Science calls. This is strategy, defense, adaptation. Psychology recognizes as a mechanism of survival, but spirituality whispers another possibility. Perhaps certain truths need to mature in the dark before returning to the light. Jung would call this diving into the unconscious, where symbols await integration. It's not an escape, it's pregnancy. And every pregnancy requires time, silence, trust. Maybe that's why we feel a strange call to hear these buried stories. They ask us without words if we don't also bury parts of ourselves, same to continue. Memories, pains, intuitions that did not fit into the world of out. Just as cities descend, consciences also descend, and in doing so, preserve the essentials. When archaeologists find underground streets, they also find human choices, to live in the invisible so as not to disappear complete. There is courage in that. There is wisdom. There is faith in a return. Because no one seals a door forever, saddle waiting for the day when it can be. Opened again time. And when we open, something in us also opens. Slowly, without fanfare. Maybe be it now. Perhaps. If something inside you feels a silent shiver when you imagine these cities, respect. It is not empty curiosity, it's recognition. There is an old memory that it does not just belong to Europe, but to humanity. People descend when the sky threatens, when the surface betrays, and when they come down, they learn to listen to what doesn't scream. This video, it's not about ruins, it's about remembrance, about what is preserved in the dark so as not to be corrupted by haste. If you feel like certain things are no coincidence, maybe this story is what your soul needed to hear. Stay with me. Breathe. Go down with me. Slowly. Because along this journey, we won't just reveal what lies beneath Europe. Let's touch on why humanity has time and time again chosen the underground. Catastrophes, persecutions, imposed silences, but also initiations, sacred refuges, portals of transformation. Every buried city is a mirror. It reflects our ability to survive without losing our soul. As we move forward, questions will arise, certainties will fall, and perhaps you will realize that this is not a documentary, but an invitation. an invitation to remember who we are when light fails and silence teaches. And that's just the beginning. Listen. Wait. Feel. For centuries, we have learned to look at Europe as a continent that built upwards. Towers, walls, cathedrals, palaces, everything seems to point to the sky, as if history were just an ascending line of progress and light. But this is only half the narrative. The other half was hidden, buried, erased carefully, because while empires grew on the surface, entire cities they were dug down, in silence away from official records. And we are not speaking of improvised shelters, but of true underground urban centers, with streets, rooms, ventilation and water systems. Structures that required planning, knowledge, and, above all, conscious intention to disappear. The best-known example is in Cappadocia, a region now located in Turkey, but culturally linked to the heart of ancient Europe. There, underground cities like Derinkuyu and Kaymakli descend tens of meters below the ground, with multiple levels capable of housing thousands of people for long periods. These cities, they did not emerge from a single hasty excavation, were expanded over the course of generations, layer by kamada, as if every people who passed there understood something essential. At certain moments in history, surviving meant not being seen. The surface might be power, but the underground was continuity. What draws attention is not just the existence of these cities, but the effort deliberate to erase them. Disguised entrances, circular stone doors that they sealed off entire corridors, tunnels designed to confuse invaders. None of that, it is the result of chance. Archaeology describes these structures as responses to wars, invasions, and religious persecution. And yes, these factors existed, but the explanation purely practical does not exhaust the mystery, because if it was just fear, it would be enough run away. Excavating an entire city requires something deeper, a collective commitment with the invisible, a bet on time. Interestingly, many of these cities have disappeared not only physically, but also historical memory. There are no detailed chronicles describing his construction. There are no reports celebrating its founders. It's as if they were designed to leave no traces. The official history, written by the winners of the surface, it rarely records those who chose to descend. This forces us to face an uncomfortable question. How many parts of human history were erased not because of lack of importance, but because they threatened the dominant narrative? A witch cannot be controlled in daylight, is often pushed into the oblivion. From a psychological perspective, this pattern is familiar. Jung described how societies, as well as individuals, repress content that cannot be integrated. What is too disruptive, ambiguous, or transformative is pushed to the unconscious. Underground cities function as collective symbols of this process. They represent knowledge, ways of life, and choices that are not fit into the discourse of linear progress. Instead of being destroyed, they were preserved in the dark, not to deny its existence, but to protect it until someone was ready to remember. There is also a spiritual aspect that rarely makes it into the books. In many cultures in ancient times, descending to earth was a sacred act. Initiations took place in caves. Oracles spoke from below. Gods were associated with the underworld not as forces evil, but as guardians of profound mysteries. Going down meant dying symbolically to the old identity and return transformed. When we observe entire cities built below the surface, we need consider that perhaps they were not just physical. refuges, but spaces of transition, where the community went through periods of crisis without losing its essence spiritual. The oblivion of these cities was not just a result of time, it was also a choose. When they emerge again centuries later, they challenge the idea that civilization has always advanced in a straight line. They remind us that there were setbacks, necessary restarts and silences, that humanity not only built, but also hid to survive. And this clashes with the image comfortable of continuous progress. Perhaps this is why these discoveries are still cause so much discomfort. They suggest that true advancement is not always it happens in plain sight. When an underground city is rediscovered, something else also comes to light. No just stones and corridors, but old questions that remain unanswered. Who decided to go down first? How they convinced entire generations to continue digging? What did they know about the future to invest so much effort in something they didn't? Would it be seen? These questions resonate because they touch something alive in us. All we carry cities buried inside. Decisions we make to survive. Parts of us that we learned to hide until the world was safe again. And maybe that's exactly what these cities want to remind us of now. That the oblivion is not always loss. Sometimes it's protection. Sometimes it is a strategy soul. But there comes a time when what has been buried needs to be reviewed. No to dominate the surface, but to integrate. As we begin to understand why that so many cities have disappeared from European history, we take the first step towards understand something greater. The human impulse to descend is not a sign of weakness, but of deep intelligence. And this understanding prepares us for the next layer of this mystery, where the underground ceases to be an exception and reveals itself as a standard recurring feature of human experience. When we started to map what lies beneath European cities, we realized that underground cities are not isolated exceptions, but part of a network much quieter. Under Paris, Rome, Naples, Prague, and so many others, catacombs, tunnels, and passages stretch across centuries of history. Some were born as quarries, others as cemeteries, others as route secret. But over time, they all assumed a common function, hiding lives when the surface became dangerous. The European underground is not an accident geology ISO. It is a human archive, excavated by necessity. The catacombs of Rome are perhaps the most emblematic example. Excavated from the 2nd century, they became a refuge for Christian communities persecuted by the empire. There, in the silence of the earth, they celebrated rituals, buried their dead, and preserved your faith. But to reduce these structures to religious persecution alone is to simplify too much. The catacombs were planned with extensive corridors, chambers organized and carefully engraved symbols. They weren't hiding places. Improvised, but spaces designed to last. What was being protected there was not just physical life, but a worldview that could not yet exist in reality. Daylight. Under Paris, history takes another form. The famous Parisian catacombs began as limestone quarries, responsible for providing the stone that built the surface city. Over time, they became deposits of bones, when urban cemeteries could no longer contain their dead. Millions of skeletons were organized in geometric corridors, creating a disturbing and symbolic. The city of the living came to rest literally on the city of the dead. And that's not just macabre, it's revealing. Europe built your progress walking on buried memories, often unintentionally looked down. In other regions, tunnels had even more strategic functions. Cities' medieval people developed secret passages for escape, smuggling, or communication during sieges. Castles had underground routes that connected fortresses to distant forests. Monasteries hid libraries and relics below from the floor. In times of war, plague, or political instability, descending was the only way of preserving knowledge, lineages, and traditions. The surface could be taken, burned, rewritten, not underground. He remained out of reach immediate power. From a scientific point of view, these structures reveal a surprising mastery of engineering. Natural ventilation, humidity control, spatial orientation in complete darkness. All of this was developed without modern technology. This indicates no just technical skill, but a deep understanding of the environment underground. These people knew that descending required psychological and social. Life below ground demands cooperation, silence, discipline. It's not a place for individualism. Perhaps that is why these communities have developed such strong bonds and an almost spiritual relationship with the space they occupied. And here, an important question arises. If so many different cultures, at times distinct, resorted to the underground, are we facing a human pattern universal? Anthropology suggests so. In moments of collapse, instinct is not always run away, but go deeper. Seek shelter in the womb of the earth. Psychologically, this makes sense. The earth represents stability, permanence, something that resists the chaos of the surface. Going down means returning to the essential, to what sustains. It is no wonder that so many traditions associate the earth with the mother, the womb, the place where life is. Protected before it emerges. Spiritually, tunnels and catacombs take on even greater significance. Deep, they become liminal spaces between life and death, between the visible and the invisible. Walking through these corridors is crossing symbolic borders. Maybe that's why many reports describe strange experiences in these places. Sensation of suspended time, oppressive silence, involuntary introspection. It's not superstition. Underground environments alter human perception. They force confrontation with what has been hidden, both externally and within us. Over the centuries, many of these tunnels were forgotten, sealed, or incorporated into the urban fabric without full awareness of its extension. We build subways, foundations, and sewers running through old structures, sometimes without knowing it. A modern city literally pierces the ancient city. And occasionally something is rediscovered. A carved wall, an unexpected corridor, an ancient symbol. Each such discovery causes fascination and discomfort, because it reminds us that we are the first to occupy that space. We are just the most recent layer. These underground refugees reveal something essential about ancient Europe. It always lived in tension between exposure and concealment. The story we learned, it privileges battles, kings, and visible monuments. But the real story of survival. It often happened far from the public eye, below ground, where entire communities learned to exist without being seen. And maybe that's exactly it, ability to temporarily disappear that allowed certain cultures through centuries of chaos. When we observe catacombs, tunnels, and refuges, we realize that the underground it was just an emergency response, but a recurring strategy, a Plan B civilization. When everything failed above, there was a world below waiting. And this prepares us for an even more perplexing question. What if the impulse to descending had not only been a response to human crises, but also to something bigger, something environmental, cyclical, inevitable. This is what we will begin to explore in next layer of this mystery. There is a point at which a purely social explanation is no longer sufficient. Wars, persecution, and instability explain part of the impulse to descend, but they do not explain everything. When we observe the repetition of this behavior over millennia, in different regions of Europe, a deeper question arises. What if the subsoil was not only a response to human chaos, but also to greater natural forces, cyclical, inevitable? Earth's history is not stable. It pulses in cold cycles, extreme warming, earthquakes, eruptions, and environmental collapses, and humanity. He was always at the mercy of these silent movements. Geological studies show that Europe has experienced severe weather events even after the end of the last ice age. Long winters destroyed crops, rivers frozen for years. In certain periods, living on the surface meant face biting winds, hunger, and constant displacement. The underground offered something that the sky could not: stable temperature. Caves and underground cities keep warmth in winter and coolness in summer. It is no coincidence that many of these structures have been expanded precisely in times of climate instability. Going down was literally a biological and cultural adaptation. But the cold wasn't the only enemy. Europe is also marked by volcanic zones and seismic regions such as Italy, Greece, and parts of Eastern Europe lived with devastating earthquakes and eruptions. When the ground shakes and fire emerges, the surface becomes unpredictable. Interestingly, communities that already had networks underground plants demonstrated greater resilience. What was below often survived what was destroyed above. This suggests that the underground functioned as a kind of ark, an existential insurance against the fury of nature. There is also evidence of catastrophic flooding, rapid defrosting, after periods glacial, caused the rise of rivers and seas. Coastal cities disappeared. Entire populations were displaced. In ancient European myths, we find reports recurring of great waters that swallowed lands. The response to this trauma collective may have been twofold: moving away from the margins and seeking depth. Dig downward, away from the unstable surface waters. Once again, the earth as shelter, not as a threat. These events were not understood scientifically as they are today. For the ancient populations, catastrophes were manifestations of the divine, inevitable cycles of world. Coming down to earth could be interpreted as a gesture of humility before of these forces, a way of aligning yourself with the rhythm of the planet. Don't fight him, but welcome yourself inside. This attitude reveals a wisdom that we have lost: to recognize limits. The surface promised control and dominance. The underground had offered acceptance and survival. In the midst of this reflection, it is important to pause. If something inside you is awakening now, if this idea of cycles, breakdowns, and refuge resonates in a strange and familiar, stay until the end. Maybe the answer you are looking for is not be in the distant past, but in the pattern it reveals. Sometimes understanding why that they descended helps us understand why today we feel the same impulse, even without knowing how to explain it. From a collective psychological point of view, catastrophes leave deep marks. They break the illusion of permanence. Jung observed that after great shocks, societies tend to turn inward, seeking meaning and protection. The underground, in this context, it is not just physical, but symbolic. It is the return to the essential when external structures fail. Underground cities can be seen as concrete manifestations of this psychic movement. When the external world collapses, consciousness descends to reorganize itself. Spiritually, many European myths speak of descents into the underworld as necessary stages of transformation. Heroes who descended into the underworld return wisely. Gods who inhabit the earth control the cycles of death and rebirth. Perhaps these narratives are not just metaphors, but memories archetypal of periods in which survival required literally living below. A spirituality, then, does not arise despite the catastrophe, but because of it. The trauma collective generates myths, rituals, and underground sacred spaces. When we bring together geology, climatology, mythology, and archaeology, a picture emerges unsettling. The descent underground was no exception, but a recurring response to an unstable planet. Europe, which today seems solid and predictable, was the scene of collapses that forced humanity to adapt or disappear. The buried cities are silent witnesses of this adaptation. They say, "We have already faced the end of world before, and we survive, not by running away, but by going deeper." This realization changes everything. Because if the impulse to descend is linked to cycles natural, then it does not just belong to the past. He can return. And maybe, unconsciously, it is already returning. When we understand that our ancestors prepared for collapse by descending to Earth, we are invited to reflect on how we are dealing with our own global crises today. But before you answer that, we need to explore something even deeper. Why do these memories seem live within us, even without having experienced these events? The answer takes us into the human mind where Earth and memory meet. There is a moment when research stops being just historical or geological and starts playing something more subtle. Even without having lived in underground cities, something about them moves us. It's not just intellectual curiosity, it's recognition. As if these structures awaken a memory that is not personal, but shared. Carl Jung called this invisible field the collective unconscious, a reservoir of images, symbols, and experiences. Accumulated by humanity throughout over time. In it, certain experiences do not disappear. They just fall asleep, waiting for the moment to emerge again. When we look at buried cities, tunnels, and catacombs, we activate archetypes deep. The descent, the dark, the shelter, the silence. These symbols appear in dreams, myths, and rituals from practically all cultures. Jung noted that in periods of personal or collective crisis, dreams of caves, basements, and worlds underground become more frequent. Not as negative omens, but as signs of psychic reorganization. The mind descends when it needs to restructure itself. A humanity, it seems, does the same. European underground cities can be seen as physical manifestations of this collective psychic process. They are not just practical responses to threats external, but material expressions of an internal movement, preserving the essential when the external world becomes chaotic. Just as the individual withdraws into heal, entire societies retreated to survive. The underground became the unconscious of civilization, guarding what could not be exposed without risk of destruction. This helps explain why so many of these cities have been so forgotten, almost deliberate. The unconscious is not erased. He is repressed. What cannot be consciously integrated is pushed down, but continues to influence behaviors, choices, and fears. Modern Europe built its identity about ideas of rationality, progress, and control. The underground cities, Remember that this identity was also born from fear, vulnerability, and need to disappear. Integrating this memory is uncomfortable. Maybe that's why it has been delayed for so long. There is an even more intimate aspect to this connection. Each human being carries his own buried cities themselves, experiences that could not be fully lived, emotions that were silenced to ensure social survival, hidden talents, unelaborated pains, ignored intuitions. When we come across traces of entire lives lived, in the dark, something inside us responds, not because we want return to that world, but because we recognize the mechanism. We know, deep down, the witch is living hiding parts of yourself. From a therapeutic point of view, Jung stated that healing does not occur by eliminating the unconsciously, but when dialoguing with it. Bring to light what was buried without violence at the right time. Underground cities seem to ask the same. They do not require veneration nor fear, just recognition. They tell us that there was wisdom on the descent, and that denying this impoverishes our understanding of history and of us same. It is not about glorifying suffering, but about honoring the intelligence that allowed to cross it. Spiritually, many traditions speak of the soul as something that goes through cycles of descent and ascent. The dark night precedes the revelation. Winter prepares spring. Buried cities make this universal rhythm visible. They are pauses prolonged in history, moments in which humanity chose introspection forced. And just like in psychology, these pauses are not empty, they are fertile. It's in dark, in which seeds germinate. It is in silence that new structures are formed. Perhaps that is why, when rediscovered, these cities cause so much impact. They emerge at a time when humanity is once again facing crises, global issues, environmental uncertainties, and collapses of meaning. The collective unconscious responds by bringing up old images, remembering. Solutions that once worked. Not to be repeated literally, but to inspire internal attitudes similar: collection, cooperation, humility before the earth. The memory ancestral does not dictate what to do, but suggests how to feel. There are those who say that the past does not call us, but maybe that's just half true. The past calls when the present looks dangerously like it, and the underground cities, upon emerging again, seem to ask if we learned something, if we are able to recognize our limits. Before the collapse forces us to descend again, they do not offer ready-made answers, they offer mirrors. And what we see in them depends on the courage to look within. By integrating this psychological perspective, something clicks. The underground ceases to be just a physical space and reveals itself as a state of consciousness, a place where humanity kept its ability to adapt, waiting for the right moment to remember her. And if this memory still lives in us, then the inevitable question arises. What else was kept in this dark? Not just emotions and symbols, but perhaps knowledge, techniques, and understandings that we have not yet recovered completely. It is to this unsettling possibility that we now turn, where silence not only holds memory, but also forgotten technology and choices deliberate not to remember. As underground cities are studied in more depth, it emerges growing discomfort, not just for what they reveal, but for what they demand that we explain. Many of these structures challenge narratives, traditions on the technological level of the societies that built them. Ventilation efficient without electricity, structural stability for centuries in living rock, precise guidance in environments without natural light. All of this was accomplished without the instruments that we consider basic today. The question is no longer, how survived, and becomes, how did they know so much? And that question is rarely answered clearly. Modern engineers who analyze cities like Derinkuyu admit that reproducing something similar today would require complex planning, manpower expertise, and considerable time. It's not impossible, but it's far from trivial. Oh, what's more intriguing is that these solutions emerged independently in different regions and times. There is no single manual, a centralizing empire, or a school known that explains the dissemination of this knowledge. This suggests that there was a practical understanding of the underground. Environment conveyed in an organic way, perhaps oral, perhaps ritualistic, perhaps deliberately unrecorded. Here, the historical silence begins to take its toll. Large surface works are usually celebrated, signed, associated with kings and dates, not underground ones. There are almost no names, precise chronologies, or detailed accounts. It's as if someone had decided that this knowledge should not circulate freely. Archaeology traditional tends to classify this as a simple absence of records, but when the absence is systematically repeated, it becomes a given in itself. Silence, too, communicates. It can indicate forgetfulness, but also choice. There are precedents for this in history. Knowledge considered dangerous, subversive, or destabilizing actions are often restricted. Techniques for construction, maps, escape routes, extreme survival methods. In times of instability, whoever controls knowledge controls the future. The city's underground may have been more than refuges, may have been centers of preservation of knowledge that was of no interest to surface powers. No disappearing is a technology, and perhaps one of the most effective. From a scientific point of view, there are still aspects that have not been fully explained. Air circulation in deep environments, for example, was solved with systems ventilation passives that still work today. The choice of materials, the angle of the corridors, the distribution of spaces, everything indicates testing, observation, and refinement over time. This is not improvisation. It is high empirical engineering level. The problem is that this engineering doesn't fit well into the linear narrative of technological progress, where everything starts simple and evolves gradually. Here we see peaks of sophistication in contexts considered primitive. This dissonance generates resistance. It is more comfortable to attribute these works to long periods of trial and error than admitting real gaps in our understanding. Science, like any human system, also has comfort zones. When something threatens to reconfigure the timeline or redistribute historical merits, tends to be minimized, not because of individual bad faith, but because of institutional inertia. The result is a cautious, almost timid treatment of these discoveries. They are recognized but rarely delved into its broader implications. There is also the hypothesis of inheritance of knowledge, that these techniques do not have invented from scratch, but transmitted by previous cultures today missing. Prehistoric Europe is less understood than we like to admit. Large gaps separate entire periods. If advanced knowledge existed and were passed on in a fragmented way, this would explain both the sophistication regarding the absence of clear records. Knowledge would have survived not in books, but in practices. Not in visible monuments, but in hidden spaces. Spiritually, this resonates with the idea of kept mysteries, traditions. Initiatives have always spoken of knowledge that cannot be exposed indiscriminately, not out of elitism but out of responsibility. Certain truths, they require maturity to be used without causing destruction. Maybe the underground also worked as a filter. Only those who needed to know, knew. Just who I went down, I learned. This is not romanticization, is a possibility that emerges when we cross historical data with recurring symbolic patterns. The most disturbing thing is to realize that even today there is resistance to exploring completely certain underground sites, limited access, excavations interrupted, studies postponed. Officially, we talk about preservation, security, lack of resources. All of this is valid. But the pattern repeats itself frequently enough to raise legitimate suspicions, not about fanciful conspiracies, but about priorities. What we choose to investigate reveals what we are ready for to accept, and perhaps we are not yet ready for everything that the European underground has to say. When viewing these cities as products of forgotten engineering, something changes. They stop being archaeological curiosities and become messages, no messages of technological superiority, but of intelligent adaptation. Usage. I need the resources available. Community cooperation at levels that we see today seem rare. Perhaps the greatest knowledge lost is not technical, but social. A ability to act collectively in silence, without glory, to get through times. Difficult. This recognition sets the stage for the last big question before the closure. If these cities reveal so much about how we survive, what do they say about who we really are? Not just as ancient Europeans, but as humanity. Because deep down, technology, memory, and silence point to something greater. An identity built not just on visible achievements, but on invisible choices that guaranteed our continuity. This is what we need face it now, without fear of going down again. After going through layers of stone, memory, catastrophe, and silence, there remains a question that can no longer be avoided. What these underground cities reveal about us, not just as heirs of ancient Europe, but as humanity. Because in the end, ruins don't just talk about the past, they talk about patterns. And patterns reveal identity. Buried cities are not historical anomalies, are involuntary confessions about how we react when everything we know threatens to collapse. The first truth is uncomfortable. We are not a species just built about expansion, conquest, and visible progress. We are, above all, a species adaptive, able to retreat to survive, able to disappear to continue existing. Underground cities show that strategic retreat is part of our collective intelligence. There are times when advancing is dying, and our ancestors knew this. They chose to preserve life, culture, and bond human, even if it meant giving up the surface shine. This directly confronts the modern myth that visibility is synonymous with success. We live in an era that celebrates the exposed, the quick, the ostentatious. But the deep history of humanity tells something else. It shows that the essential it rarely develops in the spotlight. It ripens in the dark, protected from external interference. The underground cities were not places of glory, but of continuity. And maybe this reveals something we forget. Not everything that matters. It needs to be seen to exist. There is also a lesson about collectivity. Living underground requires cooperation extreme. There is no room for excess, inflated ego, or constant disruption. Every action affects the whole. The air, the water, the food, the silence. Everything is shared. This forces us to recognize that, at critical moments, Human survival depends less of brilliant individuals and more of synchronized communities. The cities buried are monuments to interdependence. They say that we always saved more than the I. Psychologically, this resonates deeply. The collective unconscious holds no just traumas but also solutions. When we face crises today, we feel a strange impulse to slow down, to collect ourselves, to seek simplicity. This drive is not weakness, it's memory. It is the human psyche remembering that it has already crossed the collapse before, which has already survived without guarantees. Who knows on some level that the answer is not always in doing more, but in doing less, with more consciousness. Spiritually, these cities reveal a different relationship with time. Who builds something underground does not think about immediate recognition. Think about generations, in silent continuity. This requires faith. Not necessarily F is religious, but faith in the life to come. Faith that there will be a tomorrow worthy of receiving the which has been preserved today. This kind of faith is rare in societies obsessed with present, but it was essential for humanity to get here. There is an even more subtle truth. The buried cities show that the humanity has always known that the world is not stable. What civilizations rise and fall, what systems fail, that the surface changes. Instead of denying this, our ancestors prepared. They accepted impermanence as part of existence. This acceptance did not make them passive, made them strategic. They didn't fight against the cycle. They aligned themselves with him. When we look at the present, this revelation becomes unsettling. We live once again a time of global instability, climate, economy, identity, meaning. Everything seems in transition. And interestingly, we see a symbolic resurgence of underground. Bunkers, refugees, minimalism, search for smaller communities, return to the essentials. Even without realizing it, we are repeating old gestures. No because we want to live in the past, but because the past lives in us. Underground cities don't ask us to dig again. They ask us to let us learn. May we recognize that surviving is not about mastering everything but knowing when to retreat. That progress without conscience generates collapse. That the real human intelligence is not just in the technology we create, but in the wisdom of when and how to use it, and above all in the humility of accepting that we do not control the earth, we just dwell on it for a while. There is something deeply comforting about this, knowing that we are not the first to feel fear of the future, that others have already felt, have already hidden, have already waited, and that despite everything they returned. Buried cities are letters left in time. They say, we've been here before. We have already faced the end. And still, we choose to care for each other and preserve what matters. Perhaps this is the biggest revelation of all, that when stripped of illusions we always return to the same point, to cooperation, to silence, in depth, to choice to protect life before impressing the world. If we can hear this message now, perhaps we don't need to repeat the descent in the harshest way. Perhaps we can integrate the wisdom of the underground without having to disappear completely. But to do that, you have to face the final silence that these cities offer. One silence that is not empty, but full of meaning. A silence that prepares us for the last reflection of this journey. Because after everything we've seen, all that's left is an essential question, the one that echoes when the light goes out and we are alone with ourselves. And that is where we are going to land now, carefully at the end of this history. We reached the quietest point of this journey. After descending through layers of stone, memory, and meaning, all that remains is the pause. The cities that disappeared under Europe does not ask for applause or fear. They ask to be listened to. They don't scream truths, they just raise questions. And perhaps the most important is this: what we do when we realize that survival has always required depth. These cities, are not invitations to escape the world but to inhabit it more fully. Consciousness. They remind us that haste makes us fragile and that the invisible, many sometimes, it's what keeps us alive. When everything fails on the surface, the essential is not disappears. He withdraws, and returns only when it finds sufficient maturity to be welcomed without being destroyed. Today we don't need to dig tunnels underground. We need to dig inside, review values, reduce excesses, strengthen bonds. The underground as a state of soul remains available. It manifests itself in chosen silence, in listening deep, in the courage not to compete when the world demands speed. This is an ancient wisdom, but still current. If this message touched something in you, don't dismiss it with distraction. Allow she echoes. Sign up and follow us, because this journey doesn't end here. Your soul. You may be remembering the path, little by little, without rushing. And when the night comes, when the future seems uncertain, remember, humanity has already passed through the darkness before, not by overcoming the world, but by learning to inhabit the world's silence. Maybe what we call collapse is just an invitation to come down, take care of the essentials, and return transformed. And if what we feel today as an end is, in fact, the beginning of a memory that the soul has not yet forgotten, breathe, trust, and allow the silence to do its work. The answer doesn't run, it waits inside you. Now,